What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at the companions in The Outer Worlds 2, following a trailer at Gamescom, plus actually kind of compiling a bunch of information from their previous deep dive to give us a pretty clear picture, I think, of who these companions are, how they're going to assist you in combat, and kind of the general gist of their story as well. Because while the Gamescom trailer itself was a little on the short side, it mostly just kind of gave us names and factions and stuff in a sort of quick-fire round. What I was able to do is actually take that information and then combine it with what they talked about during the Outer Worlds 2 deep dive that Xbox did back in, I believe it was June. Just so you know, I'm not like pulling all of this out of thin air. But before we dive fully in here, a couple of important notes. It's already been stated that there won't be any proper romance here in The Outer Worlds 2. However, to be a little more specific, what they've said at the end of their trailer is that you won't be able to sleep with any of them, which, while already a bit of a departure from a typical video game romance these days, doesn't necessarily preclude an actual romance of sorts. In fact, if you've played Obsidian's recent title of Avowed, you might very well see where I'm going with this. There is a companion in that game, just the one really, that if you choose like all the right dialogue options and have a bunch of conversation and do their quests and everything, you can end the game by that kind of like leading into a potential relationship. It just doesn't happen like in the game itself. And that kind of does make me wonder also with their very specific wording here of just not being able to sleep with them, if that isn't something they plan on doing with this game. But that's honestly just speculation on my part. Another thing worthy of a reminder is that The Outer Worlds 2 is taking place in a different space colony, so it's not really going to directly relate back to the one in the original title, but there have been some changes. For instance, Auntie Cleo's and Spacer's Choice have combined into Auntie's Choice as one sort of super conglomerate. But the last thing I wanted to mention before we start talking specific companions here is that how you treat these people and go about their missions and stuff is supposed to heavily impact the ending. That's what they've said, which is probably no surprise then that all of them are very much tied to the different factions, and a lot of these factions have very differing views and things, which has me curious at least to see how much they impact the ending, given that, again, kind of all of them want different things for this colony ultimately. With all of that said, let's actually dive fully into it and start talking about these guys. So kicking it off with Niles. Niles is, like your main character, going to be working for the Earth Directorate. But much like you, it looks like Niles will have a choice to make, either turning their back on the Earth Directorate, which is something your character will be able to do, or sort of reaffirming their attachment to it. That said though, Niles is a mechanic, has clearly lived a bit of a rough life, plenty of scars and artificial limbs to show for his long career at the behest of his corporate overlords. Now, he also apparently comes with a sort of side companion known as Valerie. Valerie is a robot who is also technically under the Earth Directorate's wing. In particular, in terms of like combat and things, it looks like Valerie's going to perform the role of a healer, and is apparently quite the smartass. But here is where things get interesting. So, our next one is Azza. Azza is a cultist, basically, in particular a member of the faction called the Glorious Dawn. She is actively described as a psychopath, and that kind of shows in her little gameplay reveal, as she primarily seems to focus on melee weapons, getting up close and personal, spreading blood everywhere she goes. But, to be a little more specific, the Glorious Dawn, which hasn't gotten too much of a mention in their previous updates and things like that, has actually been mentioned before though, but it requires a bit of a setup to understand what's going on. So the crisis, if you will, at the core of The Outer Worlds 2 is that the skip drives that they use for faster than light travel, which allows them to operate all these space colonies, was made roughly here. The Protectorate, another faction, descended from the guy who invented it. However, its use is starting to sort of create these rifts that are interrupting travel and basically making that travel impossible, which affects trade and obviously profits in a corporate dystopia. But as with any great power, there are people who worship those rifts, and that's what the Glorious Dawn is all about. They're basically a cult that sees these warp rifts as something to be worshipped, and that is Azza for you. Apparently you're going to be able to decide her adherence to this, as well as her bloodthirsty nature. Do you try to turn her away from that, or, let her go crazy, I suppose? Or let her continue to be crazy, perhaps. But that seems to be the gist of what she's got got going on. Next up, I think we've got one of the more interesting ones in the form of Inez. So Inez is a combat medic that works for Auntie's Choice, that combination of Spacer's Choice and Auntie Cleo's from the first game. Now that's an interesting one because Inez is simultaneously an employee and kind of the product of Auntie's Choice, and her quest and what you can do largely seems to be around resolving the crisis that is her left arm, it would seem. So Inez took part in a bunch of experiments by Auntie's Choice where they were grafting animal parts onto people just to see if they could be enhanced in some way, and that was about as horrific as it sounds, with most people obviously not surviving the experimentation. It looks like, in addition to being a combat medic and a healer, obviously, she has some specific abilities related to using that arm. Some of the gameplay we see there is her like shooting these like swarms of things out of her mutated arm, and her quest obviously revolves around trying to deal with that arm. Seems like a bit of a problem, if you'd believe it. Now that's going to be interesting though, I think, because Auntie's Choice is very clearly all about trying to make as much profit as possible out of this situation, which is obviously the case with these skip drives, and if you can fix this problem and of course take control of it from the Protectorate, that would be a big deal for them. So I'm curious to see how she plays out specifically. She's not the only interesting one though, because next up we've got Marisol, the elderly assassin, or retired assassin maybe is the way to put it. Marisol seems to focus mostly around utility and obviously damage dealing, but in particular they show her like putting enemies into stasis and things like that with an ability of hers, which obviously I would imagine helps with the assassinations, but she's also a member of the Order of the Ascendant. Now that is technically speaking a new faction, but really it's a sort of splinter from the religious order that you could experience in the Outer Worlds. Now their kind of goal is to solve the equation that they think is at the heart of everything, a sort of science-based religion, if you will. Now what's interesting here is that they used to work directly with the Protectorate here, but they actually broke away from them because they believe that they should be trying to solve life's great equation for the good of everyone, as opposed to finding ways to keep people down with it, which is what the Protectorate wants from it. So an assassin with a heart of gold, perhaps. Though it looks like a lot of her story is probably going to revolve pretty directly around with what the Protectorate's doing, which brings us to our final companion, which is Tristan. Tristan is an arbiter of the Protectorate. The Protectorate are a wealthy dictatorship that keeps this colony in an iron grip. Or at least it did until the rifts started, I suppose. Basically, though, in order to manage their protection, let's call it, the Protectorate effectively operates a dictatorship, as mentioned, but also a surveillance state where they control everything about everyone's lives here. They are the descendants of the person who invented the skip drive, which is why they have control over this colony, and with the rifts here and us being sent here by the Earth Directorate to get to the bottom of things, that obviously poses a bit of a problem. It's safe to say Tristan is probably along for the ride in order to see what the Earth Directorate is up to and, subtly spying on you. So another one that I imagine will be pretty directly tied into the main story in that way. Now in terms of combat, this is your big melee tank guy. Wields a big two-handed hammer, goes in, heavily armored, gets up front and personal, which I imagine is pretty handy if you plan on, being something like a ranged character as an example. But as we can see with all of those companions laid out before us, plenty of opportunities for all sorts of conflict and back and forth. Like, for instance, I'm very curious to see how Azza and Marisol get along, as they are fairly at odds with each other in a more philosophical way, whereas, things like the Protectorate and the Order of the Ascendant are a little more practically opposed in what they want to do with the knowledge they are after, as an example. So I think it'll be interesting to see some of this conflict and stuff play out, and then, as I mentioned, of course, this is supposed to also be impacting the ending in some way, based on how you treat these people, and presumably whether or not you do their quests and things like that, which, alongside all of the conflict and presumably different endings, I would say, might have a significant impact on the different possible endings. But obviously, for any further confirmation, we will simply have to wait and see, because as for today's video, I think that is pretty much going to wrap it up. Not too much else to say, besides the fact that I think Azza, Inez, and Marisol are the ones I am personally the most interested in. But either way, looking forward to getting my hands on this when it releases at the end of October, on the 29th to be specific. Then obviously I'll be reviewing it when the time comes. So if you enjoyed all of that, by all means stick around, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.